I have some fun Emboss Resist techniques that you're going to want to try. Hey everybody, it's Christina from Creations with Christina. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you are having a wonderful day. Today I want to share with you some fun ways that you can level up your Emboss Resist technique. So grab your embossing supplies and let's hop into today's video. Before we get into our techniques, I thought I would just share with you the basic tools you'd need for embossing, as well as how to use embossing powder. I'm going to make it super simple, really quick, and then we'll get into the techniques. So I'm going to start off with our tools. I have just this little caddy right here that has some of the tools in it. So first thing you're going to need is some cardstock. I'm going to be using 80-pound cardstock as well as watercolor paper. So that is kind of an essential when you're working with embossing powder. And then I have this little caddy over here that's got my other things in it. In the back here, I just have some pieces of copy paper that I can use to catch my embossing powder when I'm sprinkling it onto my cardstock so that I can funnel it easily back into the container. Of course, you're going to need embossing powder. For just showing you how to do the basics, I'm going to use black embossing powder, but for the other techniques that we're going to be doing today, I'm going to use white and clear. You're also going to need ink that will work with embossing powders. So this one is VersaMark. There's also other companies that make an embossing powder ink, and they all pretty much work the same. So I just happen to use VersaMark. I've been using it since I've started card making. It's the only kind I've ever used, and I like it. So you're going to need that. I also have some anti-static powder. So anti-static powder comes sometimes in a little pouch, and I have one of those as well, but I've been using this one lately. This is by Simon Says Stamp, and it's got the powder down in this little container at the end, and when you shake it up, the powder comes to the brush, and then you can use that to brush this onto your cardstock. And this is so that you keep any oils or anything that you've maybe had on your fingers when you touched your cardstock, to keep your embossing powder only sticking to your VersaMark ink rather than to everything else like oils or anything that may have been on your hands. You're also going to need stamps. So I have just a couple stamps pulled out here that I'm going to use for just showing you the basics, but I'm going to be using a bunch of other stamps for the techniques. I also have my acrylic blocks here. I am not going to be using acrylic blocks. I'm going to be using my Misti and my little press here for my Misti. But if you don't have a Misti, everything we're doing will work with acrylic blocks. You're also going to need a heat gun. This is my heat gun. I do not think this heat gun is available anymore. I've had this heat gun for many, many years, and I've been using it for years. Love this gun. If anything ever happened to it, I think I'd be really sad. But you're going to need a heat gun. Do not use the Ranger Heat It tool. Well, you can use the Ranger Heat It tool. It will take a long time for your embossing powder to melt. That is more for drying paint and watercoloring and stuff like that. But a regular heat gun is the best way to go. I also have a cloth here for cleaning up any of the embossing powder that gets stuck to my work surface. Speaking of work surface, you're going to want something that's heat resistant. If you're using one of the rubber self-healing mats as your desktop protector, you are definitely going to want to put something on top of it that is heat resistant, because the heat gun will warp it, especially if you are heating so close to it. If you hold it up in the air and you're heating it, you'll be fine. But if you set it on your desktop and try to heat it that way, you will warp that mat. So you definitely do not want to, you definitely want to put something on it, or just, heat your object up in the air. But the rubber mats will get warped. I'm going to show the basics for embossing first. If you already know how to do embossing and use it all the time, go ahead and skip on to the next chapter. I've left timestamps down below so that you can skip ahead, or if you want to come back later and refer to a different technique, you can go ahead and do that. But for those of you that are brand new to using embossing powders, I am going to show you how to use them, and then we'll move into the different techniques. So I'm going to grab my VersaMark ink. I'm going to use an acrylic block to start, but I am going to be switching over to my Misti when I start doing the techniques. And I'm going to grab my stamp. And I think I'm probably going to need my larger size acrylic block here. So I'm going to put that one back inside. And I am going to stamp out this hello sentiment onto my piece of cardstock here. So I'm just going to peel this off I'm going to set my stamp onto my cardstock just as a place for it to rest. And then, especially because of my glass top, that will stick pretty good to the glass top. And then I'm just going to take my block and set it down on top of it, just as a way to pick up that stamp. I'm going to take my anti-static powder, give it a little shake, and I am going to take the top off, and then I'm just going to spread that all over this piece of cardstock, even though I'm only probably going to be stamping right in the middle of this. But if I was going to use this for a backdrop, I would definitely want to make sure I cover the whole thing so that my embossing powder only sticks where I want it to. Now that my cardstock's all prepped, I'm going to use my VersaMark ink and ink up my stamp. So I'm just going to give this a really good inking. So we're just going to make sure it's got a really good coating on it. You can buy refills for your VersaMark ink if you need it. And I'm just going to go ahead and stamp this down. I feel like it's been a long time since I've used an acrylic block because I mostly use my Misti, but I am going to do this. I can do this. All right, I like to give it a nice good press. I also like to let it sit for a few seconds. It helps transfer that thicker ink, which is what VersaMark is a real nice thick wet ink. And we want to just make sure that it's on there really well. I'm just gonna lift this straight up. I just added a piece of my copy paper to the back, and you can see I have it folded, so it's just a way that it makes it easier to funnel my embossing powder back into the container. I'm going to sprinkle this on right over my sentiment that I stamped out with the VersaMark ink. Give it a couple good taps. I even sometimes will blow on it. See, I have a lot of extra up here. I'll blow on it, and then if that's not enough, I will grab my paintbrush and I will just brush away anything that is not supposed to be there. I also like to double add my embossing powder to make sure I have a real nice coverage. I'll give it a couple of good taps as well, and I'll blow it off just to make sure there's nothing extra on there. So you can see it pretty much is just stuck to my ink and not to anything else. Then I'm going to take my paper and I'm going to funnel my embossing powder back into my container. Make sure we get that lid on there, and then I'll take my rag and just clean off any loose embossing powder so I don't get it anywhere else. And then what I'm going to do is grab my heat gun. I'm going to probably turn the volume down so it's not so loud for you, but we're going to go ahead and melt our embossing powder. I wanted to zoom in just a bit so you can see what it looks like as it embosses. And then we end up with this really pretty, kind of shiny, embossed look. The first one is just going to be a basic Embossed Resist, and I am going to be using my Misti. If you get a Misti and you have a Misti, you know there's usually a pad of paper, or if you've bought the separate pad to go inside of here, you know that's usually in here. But I am using a red rubber stamp today, which is a little bit thicker. So I need the extra space, so I take that mat out. What I'm going to do is put in my stamp and stencil mat, and I stuck that right in here. I'm going to grab my magnet that I keep right on the side over here, in case I ever need it. And I am going to go ahead and stick that down right onto my mat just to keep everything in place. This is perfect because this is sticky, so I can go ahead and stick my cardstock onto the mat and it'll hold it in place and I don't have to worry about it moving around. I'm going to take my red rubber stamp. I'm going to set that right over the top of that piece of cardstock, and then I'm going to go ahead and close the door to pick that stamp up, and now it's stuck to the lid of my Misti. I'm going to grab my VersaMark ink, and we are going to ink this up really well. Get a nice good coating of our VersaMark ink on here. And before I do anything else, because this is something I forget all the time, and I almost forgot it again, is we need to grab our anti-static and put that down onto our piece of cardstock just to keep so that our embossing powder only sticks to our VersaMark ink and not to anything else, maybe oils or something from our skin that we touched our cardstock with. So we are going to give that a nice good coating. And then I am going to close this up. And then I have my little press here, and that just helps to make sure I get a nice good coating. I love using this when I'm using larger stamps. I also like using it when I have a stamp set that's maybe it's not quite, it's very detailed and it needs a little extra pressure. I'll use this as well. So I am just going to make sure I have a good, nice good coating on this. I'm going to lift it up. And if you turn your cardstock, you can see I have good coverage. So I can see, I don't think you're going to be able to see it, but I can see that I have good transfer of my VersaMark ink. I'm going to pull my magnet out there. I'm going to set this aside. And then to get our cardstock off this mat, I'm just going to curl it backwards, and you can see our cardstock will start to pop up, and it just makes it easier so that we're not wrinkling our cardstock by pulling it off, which I feel like I'm wrinkling anyway. Got my piece of scrap copy paper here so that I can use that to catch my embossing powder. I know a lot of people like to keep their embossing powders in separate containers, larger containers. For space reasons, I keep mine just inside the original container. And for this one, I'm using just a white embossing powder. I'm going to sprinkle this onto my background, trying not to spill it anywhere except for onto my cardstock. Making sure I have a nice good coverage. So you could probably see it when I hold this at different angles, but you cannot see it when I leave it flat. So we're going to try to make sure you get a good view of this since I'm using a white embossing powder on top of white cardstock. All right, so this is a background stamp, so it's a pretty big covered area. I am just going to hold it on one end, emboss, and then turn it around and hold it on the other. Some people like to use clothespins to hold them, and I've seen Simon Says Stamps, and I think Tim Holtz has those little grippy, like they look like little hands. You can use that as well. I don't want to mess up any of the sections of this, so I'm just going to hold it on the sides with my fingers. The hardest part of this when you're doing a white embossing powder on top of white cardstock is knowing whether you got all of the areas melted or you didn't over melt because you couldn't tell if it was melted. So I think I did okay. Yeah, it feels pretty good. I feel like I got everything. Oh, nope, I have missed a corner. All right, that's okay. So the corner is going to be a little bare there, but that's okay because what's going to happen is probably cut this down and use it as a panel. So I'm going to grab some ink for this, and I'm going to use this ballet slipper, which is one of my favorite pinks, and I have my blending brush right here, and I'm just going to pick up that color and I'm going to start blending in the color. And as I blend, you're going to see that the ink is going to resist and not cover that embossing powder. So we're just going to blend this in nice. Get a nice good coverage, at least on one side of it. I'm not going to do the whole panel. I am going to leave it just like this. I just really wanted to show you how the Emboss Resist works. So I went ahead and inked everything up. If I did it as a full panel, that'd be great too. But I am going to take my cloth and wipe over the top of this just to pull off any of the ink that is sitting on top of our embossed area. And isn't that gorgeous? I might even use this panel for a card because I just love the look of it being maybe a little darker on the side and then blending lighter in, getting a more subtle look with the embossed section over here. But I just think this is a lot of fun. And here's one that I did already that is a full panel piece that can be used for the background as well. So I'm going to use this floral stamp set for this next one. I'm also going to use the coordinating dies. I am going to set that aside. I'm going to grab my mini Misti here. Inside my mini Misti, I have my grip mat from Waffle Flower, and I love that, having that in there. I usually just leave it inside there because it makes it so much easier. And then I have a piece of watercolor cardstock. I am using the texture side down and then having the smoother side facing up just to make it a little bit easier to get a good coverage of our VersaMark ink. I'm going to take my stamp set here, and I love this floral piece. I think it's just so pretty. And we're going to set this right onto our cardstock. So let's see, let's just go this way, making sure we're kind of in the center because I am going to die cut these. And then we'll close our door, pick up our stamps. I'm going to grab my anti-static, make sure we get this all covered up because we don't want anything other than our embossing powder sticking to our cardstock. I am going to ink this up, and I will definitely double ink this one since we are using a little bit of a texture cardstock. Even though I'm using the smooth side, it does still have some texture to it. So we just want to make sure that we get good coverage. In this particular stamp set I have used before, and I have noticed that there are more detailed areas that do not transfer quite as well. So I am going to use my press here, and I'm going to focus on those areas first. So this particular stamp set has this little floral piece right here. I'm just going to focus on that with my press here, do the other ones, and then I'm going to come in and just do a good coverage on all of it. I just know that these little areas right here do not stamp out the best, and with the textured cardstock it definitely will not get a really good coverage. So we just want to make sure we get that really well. I'm going to lift open my cover, and then we're going to ink up one more time with our VersaMark. I'm just going to open this up. I'm going to grab my tweezers and lift that out of there. I'm going to set this aside. So I am going to grab my piece of copy paper, pick up my piece of cardstock here, and then we will add our white embossing powder. So there we go. We have our image there. I'm going to funnel this back into my container. Wipe down our desktop, and then we'll go ahead and heat set this with our heat gun. So there we go. I don't know if you can see it, but I'm going to set this aside, let it cool off a little bit, because I won't tell you how many times that I've run my hand over it and then smeared the white embossing powder because it was still too hot. So I decided to bring in my watercolors, and I am not somebody that's very good at watercoloring. As a matter of fact, I have a video for watercoloring for the non-watercolor artist, because that is certainly not me. I am not a watercolor artist, but I do enjoy it, especially if I could do it in a messy way. And this is what I love about it. So I'm going to grab, I have this little spray bottle here, and I like to activate my colors that I'm going to be using. So I'm just going to spray that. As a matter of fact, there's not enough water in my containers here. I'm not sure which color green, so I'm just going to spray all the greens and these two pinks. I'm just going to let that work itself there. And then I'm going to come through. I have just these little mason jars here with water in it. I have one that's clean and one that's for dirty water. And I am going to wet my brush and wet my images so that when I go to watercolor, it will not come down too dark onto my cardstock, but it will be a nice pastel kind of color. All right, so now that we got this nice and covered, I'm going to start pinking up some of the color. So I have another water brush here, and I have a smaller one. So let me do the smaller one to do some of these leaves. And I think I'm going to go in, let's start with this color green. I think this is the color green I want to use, which is not, there we go. I just want to make sure I didn't have too much on here. So I'm just going to come in, and I am messily going over my leaves. I'm not going to put too much effort into making sure I stay in the lines. It's just really hard to see where you're looking at a leaf versus a flower, especially in some of these other areas. Which green was it? I think I used this one. Making sure I use the same color green. So we're gonna go ahead and watercolor. And this is my favorite way to watercolor, going outside the lines. Whenever I watercolor, I can feel I cross my toes. I don't know why. Let's see, make sure we get all of these little areas that are green. Like I said, I am not very good at watercoloring, so I like to find ways to do things that are messy but then come out really pretty. So we're going to add all of this on there. So that is pretty much it for the green color. Let's take our larger brush. I'm just going to wet that one. And then I'm going to throw this brush actually into my dirty water so I don't accidentally pick it up when I don't want to. And I am going to grab this pink color. I love this color pink. Very pretty. Oh, don't put it there. All right. So we just want to make sure. Oh, that's really Barbie pink, isn't it? Okay. We're going to go ahead and put this down. Again, I am messy coloring, and I didn't even wait for any of my green to dry. So we certainly are going to accidentally blend in some of these colors. I'm going to try not to, but again, I am focused on going on the outside. I am not caring too much about how perfect my flowers are colored in. I am just getting that color in there. And I've already done this, and I love the way this came out. It was so pretty. So we're going to color in all of these pieces. So I missed a spot with a green leaf there, so we're going to need to go back and get that one. Again, making sure we're reaching out. Now I do have other colors here. There are other flowers that I think I'm going to do in a yellow color, but let's just get this one green area that I missed colored in. Okay. All right, so I am going to clean off my brush. And I think I am going to use one of these yellow colors. I think I'm going to go with this color right here. Instead of spraying it, I'm just dipping my brush and picking up the color that way and let it kind of blend onto my brush. I'm going to tap this off a little bit onto the side and looking a little greenish. All right, well, yeah, we'll use this color. So I'm just going to blend, oh there, that's nice and yellow. So I'm just going to blend this color over these other flowers. Again, not caring if I'm staying in the lines. That is the best part about this way of doing it. I don't have to care. All right, let's clean up our mess first. I'm going to take my rag and just pick up some of this color off my desk. And then I'm going to take my rag and dab it onto my piece here. I'm picking up some of that bright yellow because I didn't like how bright it was, but also kind of shining up my embossing area. So there we go. I have more of a pastel yellow. Coming off a little green on camera, but I promise it's yellow. So what you're going to want to do with this is before you do anything else, you're going to want this to dry a little bit before we start doing our die cutting. I am going to take my heat tool. If you have the heated tool, you can use that. I'm going to take my heat tool just to kind of help things dry up a little faster, but I'm going to dry it from the back, and I'm going to hold my heat gun pretty far away. So I have the coordinating dies right here, and because I've used watercolor, it's probably going to be nice warped paper. I am going to use my yellow tape to hold this in place, and then I'll run this through my embossing machine. Got a little piece right here. So the only thing I want to be careful of is that because my watercoloring is probably still a little wet, that I want to make sure that I'm not putting this on top of any of my die cut areas because it will probably peel off. So I'm going to pull this off, and then we get to reveal our messy watercoloring with a resist technique of the embossing powder. We're just going to pop that out of there. Isn't that gorgeous? And even though it's not in the lines, I just love the way that looks. I know a couple of you have mentioned that you'd love to see the whole process, including die cutting. My die cutter is not at my desk. I have to get up and move away from my desk to run my die cutting machine. However, I do have a new system here for filming videos, and I will try to see if I can get a camera set up so that we can run the die cutter and show you the die cutting process without it having to move it to my craft desk. These are the watercolor pieces. I love this, and like I said, I am not very good at watercoloring, but this makes me look like I'm a genius at it. And it's a fun resist technique that you can do with your embossing powder. Just play with your colors. You know, you can, if you don't have watercolors, you can easily take your stamp pad and smush that onto your desktop. Grab a brush with some water on it and get the same look with that as well. But I really love how this came out. I even have a little bit of yellow that, or some of the green kind of blended onto this particular flower. I don't know if the camera will pick it up, but I really love the way these came out, and they are so easy and fun to do, and it makes me look like I'm really good at watercoloring, but it's also a fun resist technique as well. This next one is a lot of fun. I have a background stamp here, and then I'm also going to be using a stencil, so I pulled out this little polka dot stencil here. Once again, using my Misti, and then I have my stamp mat in there. I'm going to stick my magnet in place and then put my cardstock down. And the first thing we're going to do is stamp our image. So for this, I'm not going to use VersaMark. I'm going to use a regular ink. So I'm just going to pull out my stamp, get that lined up here onto my cardstock, making sure that we're in the corner in case I have to stamp again. I'll close my door. And then we are going to ink this up. I'm going to be using this Pebble ink by Concord and Ninth, and we're going to stamp this out using the pebbled ink. And because I'm using a background stamp, I'm going to use my press one more time, making sure we have a nice good coverage. So I have a couple areas that could use a little bit of detailed pressing. That is pretty good. It doesn't have to be perfect because I am going to be doing a technique over the top of this. I'm going to take my magnet out, put that in place, set this aside, and I'm going to, once again, remove this from my sticky mat just by bending it backwards, and it just helps the cardstock, instead of the cardstock rolling up, once we take it off there, it lays nice. I used an ink that is a pretty slow drying ink, so I am going to heat set this before I do anything else because I want to make sure this ink is nice and dry. And one way to test to make sure your ink is dry is just go ahead and sprinkle that embossing powder onto this cardstock just to make sure it's not sticking to anything. If it sticks, then you know your ink isn't dry, but it looks pretty dry to me, so I think we're okay to go. I'm using clear embossing powder for this technique. Just gonna go ahead and funnel that back in. And before I do anything else, I am going to go ahead and take my anti-static, and we're gonna put this down onto this piece of cardstock. Make sure we got that nice and covered. And then I'm going to take my stencil. I'm going to set that right over the top of this. And grab some tape just to hold it in place so it doesn't slide all over the place. And then what I'm going to do is once I have that adhered down, I'm going to grab my VersaMark ink and I am going to just go ahead and push that into the stencil so that it is going to add our embossing ink to our stenciled areas. It's going to make sure that's nice and covered. So I'm just giving it a good, even a little twist to make sure it gets down in that stencil, just like so. And then what I'm going to do is take my clear embossing powder and put that onto our stenciled polka dots that we did with our VersaMark ink. All right, I'm going to set this back inside of my container. Close that up. give my desktop here a good wipe down to make sure I got the powder off there. And then I'm going to go ahead and heat set those stenciled polka dots. All right, just want to make sure everything is nice and melted. We're going to let this cool for a couple minutes. I'm going to clean up my desk area here. And before I do anything else, while I'm waiting for that to cool down just a little bit, I'm going to clean off this stencil. I'm just going to use some rubbing alcohol that I have in a spray bottle. And then I'll take my wipe here and just get that all nice and cleaned off. But rubbing alcohol definitely cleans off that embossing ink much easier. So you might be able to see some of that shine there from the polka dots with the clear embossing powder. I am going to grab some ink. I'm going to grab a blending brush, and I'm just going to go to town and ink this up and pull that color. So these dots look like a very light green, but I'm going to take my rag and we're just going to give it a good polish. And we're going to get that ink that's sitting on top of that clear embossing powder off of there. So as this dries, we're going to start to see some of the background stamp, the original stamping that I put down, start to peek through, but it's showing up a little bit right here and a little over here. So it's really, really hard to see when the ink is still so wet, but I love that I can see through my polka dots into the original stamping that I did. Now this is one that I did early on. It's all nice and dry. I was playing around with colors. This one was the ripe avocado, and you can see some of the stamped image that was in the background coming through that ink. And then of course you could see it all over here. And this is pretty dark over here. So I was thinking that it's going to start as this kind of blends into the cardstock, that you're going to see that a little bit more when it's done. But I just thought I'd show you using a lighter color versus a darker color. But I love that I can see some of this through that ink. And then I love that you can create some really fun backgrounds using your stencils. It's just another way to use your stencils, but also to do the Embossed Resist technique. At the beginning, I just showed you how to do the resist technique, but you can step that up by doing different color combos. So this is one that I just played with different color combos of inks that were sitting here on my desk. And then I also did one with this bright blue color, and I think that is a gorgeous color blue. But we can step this up. Because I used ink that's reactive to water, I thought this would be a good time to even add a little bit more to this. So I'm just going to take my paintbrush filled with water, give it a couple taps, and let that water react with the ink, and it'll start pulling away some of that color. Just going to let it set for a second or two, and then I'm going to just grab my cloth, especially a clean area, and I'm just going to dab, and it's going to pull up that color that we had originally laid down. We're just going to clean that up a little bit. So you can see that color pooled, and I just did it pretty quick and I didn't use a lot of water, but you can definitely use more water, have more reaction to the cardstock. But this is just a plain old cardstock, so I don't want to get it so it warps too much. But that's just an easy way to step up your basic Emboss Resist technique, just by adding some splatters of water to get your ink to react. Or if you have any kind of liquid gold pigment that you want to use, you can use white pigment. You can actually add some really pretty splatters to your basic Emboss Resist technique using a background stamp. The Emboss Resist technique is just a super fun way to go from regular embossing powder to adding some texture and style to your cards. I'm going to set this one aside. We'll just review what we already did and what we played with today. So this first one was just the basics of the Emboss Resist, stamping out our image with VersaMark ink, adding our embossing powder, and then running over and blending some ink color just to pull out that piece, that background, and then just wiping it off to get any of the residue of the ink. Such an easy way to add some color and texture to a background piece of cardstock that you're going to use on the back of your card. This is just my step up of this. This was doing it in some rainbow colors, and this is just adding some splatter to that. Of course, my favorite one is going to be these little flowers that we did on watercolor paper and our messy version of watercoloring, and I love that look. And then we have our background that we created with stamping out our stamped image using a stencil as our guide for our embossing ink, and then doing a clear embossing powder that allows that background to peek out through some of those sections that we put down with the clear embossing powder. Love this look. And I also showed you what it looks like when you use a very light color where you can still see the background, and then also the polka dots that we created with that VersaMark. I thought I would share with you a card that I finished up using some of these techniques. I stamped out a sentiment that says thanks for being kind using some white embossing powder, and then did a blue blend of some blue ink in the background, more of a focal. I didn't cover the whole background, and then added some splatter, gold splatter to the back, added my simple watercoloring with the resist technique, and then added a couple little gems on here, mounted that onto some blue cardstock, and mounted that onto my card base. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. Either you learned something new or you were reminded of techniques that you haven't tried in a long time. I will leave a link to another video I did all about embossing powders in the description of this video, and I will see you all in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.